Good morning. We'd like to start off by playing a tune by Tom Lehrer. He was a favorite of my father's and John's parents too. And so he was a mathematician, first of all, and he taught at MIT, Harvard, Wellesley, and he ended up at UC Santa Cruz. And he was teaching mathematics and musical theater. So this is a song from the 60s about pollution, and John's going to start us off. If you visit American City, you will find it very pretty. Just two things of which you must beware. Don't drink the water and don't breathe the air. Pollution, pollution, got smog and sewage and mud. Turn on your tap and get hot and cold running crud. That'll help. See the halibuts and the sturgeons being wiped out by detergents. Fish gotta swim and the birds gotta fly, but they don't inhale. There's lots of things there that you can drink, but stay away from the kitchen sink. The breakfast garbage you throw into the bay, they drink at lunch in San Jose. So go to the city, see the crazy people there, like lambs to the slaughter. They're drinking the water and breathing the air. Thank you.
Well, good morning. Thank you, Jim and John. That was very, I guess, sort of appropriate song for us, unfortunately, these days. My name is Ross Chambliss. My parents are Tim and Kathy Chambliss, who normally facilitate the Summer Forum series here on Sundays, but they're away this weekend. They're visiting my sister in New York City, and so they've left the task to me. So, which is actually great, because this particular subject that we're dealing with today is, as a journalism graduate, is very important and something I think that it's important to explore. The title of today's talk is Empowering Citizens as Investigative Journalists, Ethics and Techniques, and our speaker will be Eric Peterson, whom I'll introduce here momentarily. But I just put together a few words I thought for context to think about. I don't know if we can recount a time when journalism in America has faced as many challenges as it does today. For one, the newspaper industry is threatened by shrinking revenues and shrinking circulation numbers. And we've experienced this here recently. Last May, the Salt Lake Tribune laid off 34 members of its team. That was approximately 1/3 of its entire newsroom. And just days before that, the Ogden Standard-Examiner laid off 21 reporters, editors, copywriters, photographers, and other staff. Journalism is also threatened by a demagogue president we have who has called journalists the enemy of the people and who doesn't seem to understand or respect the importance of a free press. And now it seems that journalists are even threatened by violence in our country. All of you heard about the terrible mass shooting at a newspaper in Maryland this past Thursday. 5 journalists at the Capital Gazette newspaper were killed as they were working in their newsroom. So all of this is happening during a time when journalists in the media and our free press have never been more critical to our democracy and our way of life in our country. So what can we do? What are we to do as citizens about this? how can we contribute to a struggling newspaper industry, or just to keep journalism vital in our community? What are some techniques or resources that are useful to know, and what is important to know about the work that journalists do? What are ethics or guidelines that are important to understand? This is the discussion that we'll have today. I'm just going to introduce Eric now and read a little bit of biographical information about him. Eric Peterson has been an investigative reporter in Utah for the past decade. As a staff writer at the Salt Lake City Weekly, he broke major stories about pay-to-play corruption allegations at the Utah Attorney General's office years before his competition. He's won nearly a dozen first-place awards for the Utah chapter for the Society of Professional Journalists in the contest's most competitive division on every subject from government and consumer reporting to coverage of religion and medical to medical and science issues. He placed third nationally in the 2014 Association for Alternative News Media Awards for coverage of homelessness in Salt Lake City, a series that included time spent undercover at a local homeless shelter. He also serves as the president of the Utah Headliners chapter of the Society for Professional Journalists board, and he founded the Utah Investigative Journalism Project nonprofit in 2016 to help train journalists on investigative techniques to develop watchdog reporting for local media outlets. So now, the official mission of the Utah Investigative Journalism Project is to support, strengthen, and invigorate journalism in Utah through in-depth investigative watchdog journalism. They accomplish this through working with other journalists as collaborators or mentors, and through media partnerships that leverage collective resources with the goal of finding and telling the stories that empower the people and communities of Utah. They also offer free training to local journalists and investigative techniques, such as how to utilize databases successfully request and fight for public records and other skills. So, ladies and gentlemen, Eric Peterson.
Hi, good morning. You guys can hear me all right? Thank you for that introduction, Ross. Yeah, my name is Eric Peterson. I'm the founder of the Utah Investigative Journalism Project. This is a great honor for me. This is only the second time I've ever spoken in a church. This was unique. I'm actually from Utah County, and my family's about half Mormon, half not. I'm on the not side. And when I was in high school, my brother, he converted, and he went on a mission, and I got to speak at his farewell. And my introduction in that talk was, I said, "Good morning, everybody. I'd like to start my talk with a story from the scriptures, but I don't know any, so we'll move past that." And ironically, like within that year, the church made a new policy, and family members don't speak at their homecomings and farewells anymore. So this is great. I'm glad to be, speaking in church again, and it's great to be in this church. Your guys' music is much better too. So yeah, like I said, I've been reporting for a while. I'm not the oldest reporter in the state, but I've been reporting at an interesting time, and I was about 8 years at the Salt Lake City Weekly before I left, and ended up starting this nonprofit, the Utah Investigative Journalism Project, because I saw a real need for investigative journalism and making sure that niche was filled in our community, because I feel it's probably the most important kind of journalism. It's also the most expensive. It's also the most risky. It's usually the most thankless. It's tough, and it's a tough kind of journalism. And I wanted to make sure that it didn't disappear, as we kind of see like how in our kind of media ecosystem, a lot of papers and outlets just can't afford to take time to do in-depth stories and really spend a lot of time on a story and dig and try and find things out, the kind of things that they don't just announce at a press conference. But when I started the Salt Lake City Weekly, I was actually in a position where, like, at that time the paper was really, really well positioned for kind of long-term, enterprise stories, and that's kind of an environment where I thrived at. When I started, I really got into finding out a lot of interesting things about the Attorney General's office back then. And I remember there was a time, I was only a couple years on the job, I think it was 2007 or 2008. I read this article in the D News, and it was one of these articles where they kind of, look at, they just kind of report on campaign contribution filings. And there was a little line in the article where it said, an entrepreneur, Jeremy Johnson, donated $50,000 to Mark Shurtleff's campaign because they both shared an interest in a charity that was helping, children leaving polygamous communities. And I thought, well, yeah, that doesn't make any sense, does it? I remember thinking, well, why don't you just donate that money to the charity, instead of the politician who also agrees with that charity? And that's kind of one of the first stories that really got me on that path of looking into the Attorney General's office back at the time. And I did a lot of good stories. I did a lot of good work, but I was also in a good position to do work because even at that time, we were still kind of struggling with the internet and how that disrupted news revenues. But you can imagine even back then, about 10 years ago, how much healthier the media kind of ecosystem locally was, right? I mean, like, we had dailies that were covering a lot of stuff, and I was in a position at the Weekly where I could take a little more time, and I could look at stories that kind of crossed across many different beats. And that was an interesting thing about the Shurtleff and the AG story that I'd spent a lot of time on, was that it was kind of one of those stories that was harder, I think, for daily papers to do because they've got this system, where every reporter has a beat, and they kind of like got to focus on that beat, and you don't kind of want to step on the toes of people in other beats. And when I look back at the story about, these allegations of corruption with the AG's office, it was, it's a state government beat, it's a politics beat, it's a courts beat, it's a business beat, because you had all these businesses, with trouble. They got problems defrauding consumers, and then so they make donations to the Attorney General's office. So it crossed many different kinds of beats, and so I was in a position, to like really kind of follow that story organically. And that was kind of like how things worked well back then. And I look back at that time, and it certainly wasn't the golden age of reporting. I was not alive during the golden age of reporting, but it was still a good time where we had, media outlets kind of covering different things and being able together to kind of synthesize a good, news story, a good accounting of what was going on in our world, for our readers, And I think back to once things were really heating up in that story, how I used to have this rivalry with Robert Gerke at the Tribune, and we'd have, I would come out with a story, or he'd come out with a story, and then I'd add to it, or it would be the opposite, And we kind of fed off that competition, and this, a fuller picture of what was going on kept emerging thanks to this kind of healthy competition. But, we are now in a position where like things are drastically different, and it's getting harder. It's harder to like even have competition because there's so few of us. It feels like it's just that. And like even with when I left the Weekly, I just felt like we had gotten into the same position where we were so divided in what we were supposed to cover. We were supposed to cover everything. We used to be a weekly that just did like a weekly news story, and then we worked on these long-term projects. But then it was every day we had to contribute to some other things just to try and keep the paper sustainable, And that's something we're seeing all over in all of our media organizations. It's difficult to focus on a long-term story when you've got reporters that are just running all over the place, out of breath, from one meeting to a press conference to another thing, to a murder trial, just trying to keep up with the daily kind of breath of the city and the state, our communities. So I kind of like to talk about, some of the problems of this, kind of how things have been evolving since the disruption of the internet, and, how people have kind of imagined things are going to change in our kind of like information or media ecosystem. because there's a couple kind of models, I guess you could say, right? Like there's this kind of thought or prediction about how things are going to change that I'm kind of calling the naive prediction, right? Like that look, with the internet, the social media, we're going to have all these new voices, and they're going to just kind of spontaneously pop up, and there's going to be such a greater, more richer contribution to the dialogue because of all these voices, that they're going to complement and add to our traditional legacy media voices. And adding to that, that's going to help kind of make up for shortfalls in kind of the traditional media as they kind of go through this kind of painful growing pains and evolution and learning how to actually monetize the internet and make it sustainable into the future. That's the naive version. What I'm describing now is kind of what I think is actually happening, right? You've got the new voices that pop up, but they're actually not really, for the most part, contributing new information, because most of them don't realize that it's actually hard to report things, right? It's hard to go and find information out. It's not an easy thing. And so instead of contributing new information, all these new voices are contributing opinion and slant on the information that's already being provided, right? And so this leads to a kind of a polarization, right? You have all this dialogue going on, but it coalesces around people who find other people who believe in the exact same thing as them. And don't make any bones about it, right? Because they're contributing opinions, so they're not contributing information. Similarly, as media outlets struggle to make money from the internet, and they have to go through layoffs and budget cuts and shrinking revenues, doing more with less and less and less and less, our news quality suffers, right? So we get a lesser product. That's just how it is. There's more typos. There's more mistakes. You can't have less people and less mistakes. That's just how it goes. But this also, in turn, kind of emboldens all these new voices to believe that they're doing it better, and that the old media is always screwing up. And look, they're screwing up worse nowadays, right? Then the really troubling part, the possibility that before this necessary growing pain and evolution actually happens, where like our professional media outlets learn how to make money from the internet and have a sustainable business model, something happens, right? And that's something that happens is that an authoritarian power uses the moment to permanently cripple and subjugate the fourth estate to the control of the state, right? And this evolution that we are all waiting for with legacy media becomes a de-evolution, right? It's forced upon us. I like to imagine kind of like this naive vision of like how this media evolution is going to be is saying, look, all these new voices, they're like these new beautiful flowers popping up in a garden that weren't there before, and they're contributing to the lushness of this garden. In this other vision, I see some of these new voices are flowers, most are weeds, and they're choking the life out of this garden, right? And the plants that were the traditional media in this garden, they're suffering, they're browning, they're withering, until some strong man comes in and says, well, this just needs to be pulled out. We don't even need this anymore, so let's just get it out of here. Yeah, it's very challenging, and I like to say that there is another model that we'll talk about a little bit, a model that really hasn't happened yet and probably needs to. But I did want to talk about a little bit about some of these problems that's popped up with the new voices. One thing we mentioned, I talk about this kind of polarization, is that it's so strange to me how much this is set hold in our society. That, for example, people have become so used to social media providing these echo chambers for our pre-existing beliefs that people become offended when they read something in a traditional media that still strives for impartiality, right? Like, it strikes me as a bad sign that people want the traditional media to tell them exactly how to think, and they're offended when it doesn't. And that's the thing that bothers me. I see people, from all political stripes, look at a story and criticize the story or the paper or the reporter. It's an amazing thing. We often see, people say, like, why didn't this story just call Trump a racist? Something like that. Something to that effect. That's something you see often. It's like, I ask the question, why is it the paper's job to tell you exactly how to think? Like, if they report on something racist, he said, can't you come to your own determination? Can't you think for yourself about it? That is still the model that we're trying to hold on to. But people have become so used to their media sources telling them exactly what to think and castigating those sources that won't tell them exactly how to think, right? A really interesting example I saw a while ago was this New York Times story. I think it was about Trump going to a UN summit and, Trump making a comment about Venezuela not respecting the sovereignty of their citizens and going off on this tirade about it. And the reporter, instead of telling the reader what to think and saying, like, Trump is a hypocrite, right? Instead, the reporter followed that up by saying, Trump, on the other hand, made no mention of instances where Russia, for example, is not respecting the sovereignty of citizens of Ukraine or something like that, and showed the facts that allow the reader who's still thinking to think for themselves and get the complete picture, right? So that is a problem. We were looking at this situation where, like, media always used to be attacked for being biased, and now we're attacking them for not being biased enough. It doesn't make any sense. A problem we see sometimes too with the new voices is that. Well, actually, let me talk a little bit about this kind of I guess third model of a media ecosystem, and I think this really ties more into kind of like our theme for this talk today, I guess, is I think we're looking at a situation where if individual citizens want to get more involved in kind of their media world, like I feel like there's two important ways you can kind of do that. Like, we need to come to the support and the aid of ethical media organizations, and I think a lot of that's necessarily traditional media outlets. But if citizens want to kind of take it upon themselves to do their own kind of investigating, own kind of reporting in some way, whether that's some kind of community newsletter or a website, or forming some kind of citizens committee to kind of address a specific issue and get information out into the community, then it's really important that they adopt the ethics of the traditional media. Like the Society of Professional Journalists, we have a code of ethics, and that is just such an easy place to start. It's some stuff that just seems common sense, but that is totally rejected by a lot of kind of new voices, new media voices. Things like being accountable, being transparent, getting both sides of the story. Like if people want to create their own kind of new thing, like I said, like a newsletter or something like that, they should adhere to these ethics, and they should let the reader know that they adhere to these ethics. Even if legacy media is suffering, that is not a reflection on the ethics. That's my belief. It's a reflection on the lack of resources that's affecting quality. And that's the other crazy thing to me about this whole trend I just don't understand, is how it is that people have so wholesale rejected this idea of things like impartiality, right? And I get it. I get it. At some level, people have always kind of harbored this suspicion against, media organizations and reporters, and saying, well, they're biased. They're people. They have biases. They're not robots. They're not completely neutral. But the thing to remember is that impartiality is not like it's not like a switch we turn on, but it is a discipline. It is a discipline that is a part of professional journalism. It is a striving toward impartiality. right? It doesn't mean it's always perfect, right? We're not perfect people, but we strive toward a good ideal as a profession, and we, kind of indoctrinate ourselves with that discipline. There's this interesting psychological study. I wish I was trying to find it, but these test subjects were brought in, and they were described. It was kind of like a mock trial kind of description thing, and said, here's an accident, and they lay out some scenarios and facts, and it's like, okay, make a determination. And one group is told to just make a determination, and another group is told, okay, make a determination, but be impartial. All right. The group that's told to be impartial strives toward being impartial. They are more impartial. They are more fair. They consider both sides of the argument more closely. The group that's told not to doesn't, right? And that's what we see a lot with these new voices. They feel like it's so old-fashioned, this idea of impartiality and being fair, that they totally reject it, and they don't even try for it in the beginning, right? Excuse me. So that is something that you have to strive for. If individuals are interested in helping out in that way, you have to kind of accept that you have biases, accept that you have beliefs. It's okay to have beliefs. It's okay to be passionate about things that get you fired up. But if you're going to try and translate that into some kind of news product or some kind of issue, then out of fairness, you've got to do your due diligence, really, engage the topic, find out both sides, represent that information, and whether you're putting it on a blog, on your website, or, whether you're just gathering information and taking it to a reporter or someone, you want to have all your homework in place. You want to have documents. You want to be able to, show your work and explain, how you got the material that you got. It's interesting too, just because of how important. When I talk about this third possibility, of citizens becoming more individually involved in this, is that there really is a very critical role for citizens to especially be covering local matters or just being more engaged in them, so that, if you spot something, you could, bring it to the attention maybe of a newspaper or media outlet, or, your own thing if you want to go that route, because locally that's really where we're seeing so much suffering kind of happening. I don't know if any of you had heard about, there's this really interesting study. Let's see, it recently came out. The Notre Dame's Mendoza College of Business, they did this study on, they looked at, 1,600 English language newspapers serving 1,266 counties in the U.S. between 1996 and 2015, and they looked at these communities where they lost a paper and kind of what happened. And they found overall, those communities were soon paying a lot more for public bonds and stuff. They lost their watchdogs, and city officials didn't have anyone questioning their numbers, and they were paying more out of their own pockets. They looked at, for example, where there was this. There used to be the Rocky Mountain News in Denver. Researchers concluded that Rocky Mountain News stories had served as a watchdog agent. Without it, the spread or yield of newly issued local municipal bonds increased by 37 basis points. Researchers also looked at the Cincinnati Post, which closed in 2007. In that instance, too, the median yield spread for newly issued local municipal bonds increased by about 66.1 basis points. Another indication, according to the authors, that public finances suffer when a newspaper closes. Another example I remember thinking about, when I first got started, I remember it was just about the time that the Trib had got this. They'd found out this kind of thing. I think they called it Bonus Gate in Sandy City. They found out that the Sandy City officials had been paying themselves these huge bonuses, just excessive bonuses, and it was something that the reporters at the Trib I'm pretty sure it was Matt Canham, who's the managing director now. Remember he had. Maybe I'm not sure, but I can't remember. I remember the Trib reporters had tried to get the bonuses, and this, in terms of public records, bonuses should be a given. Like if a public official gets money from taxpayers in whatever form, that should be an easy to request record. And Sandy resisted it, took it to court. It went on for 4 years before the Trib finally got this information and was able to tell, the citizens of Sandy, like, how much excess, that their officials had been taking and keeping totally secret from them. And that's the thing, that's Sandy. And I remember talking with people about that when the Trib went through some bad layoffs before this first round, and talking about how they had to pull back reporters that used to go to these, kind of smaller. I mean, Sandy's not small, but that, weren't able to cover some of these more local, community council meetings and things like that in the county. And that's the thing, is you don't have people there. There might not be another bonus gate for a while, but when there is, who's gonna find out about it? That's really part of the challenge. Local news. I mean, it's strange because it's harder, perhaps. Maybe it doesn't have the same pull for a statewide audience. Even as we have still kind of some statewide papers, kind of holding on. It might not be just enough of a priority for them to really focus on, Sandy, or Midvale or Murray council meetings and things like that. And then, again, that might be a niche where it's good to have very engaged citizens who are going to these meetings. If they're not putting it up on a blog, for them to be able to approach a reporter and go, I was at this meeting, and at this time this issue came up. I filed a grandma request, or I looked up a database, and saw, so and so donated X amount to this member of the council. Here's some stuff I found, and do you think maybe we should run with this? And I think a reporter would be really receptive to that, especially when they know it's from a beat that they're just not able to cover at the time. I do have some things. I have a few handouts. I didn't realize this would be such a great turnout here. So I could probably get more handouts to you somehow. But I have some handouts with a few databases that are worth checking out. I think everybody should kind of know how to look up, their legislators' donations and see who's giving them money and things like that. That if anyone's interested in playing around with things like that, a database on filing grandmas and things like that. But yeah, I just it's just that I think there was a time when I think there was a time maybe when I was a little bit more bitter if somebody had asked me to talk about empowering individuals to kind of be citizen journalists. I probably would have summed up the talk with just support, the traditional media. But that's not good thinking either. As things evolve, we need supporters and we need people kind of keeping an eye out and helping. And, I'm always going to support any media organization, even if it's just a little blog or a newsletter or something that follows a code of ethics and tries to be fair and, actually does its homework in terms of its research and things like that. And we all need to be supportive of those kinds of media outlets. But, maybe just on an individual level, I think another cultural shift needs to come with just appreciating the idea of supporting the media and also understanding that the economics of it have really changed. It may come to the fact that we're going to need to, subscribe to papers, digital subscriptions. We're going to have to invest more of our dollars into our media, and we're going to have to see it as a public investment. and realize that times have changed, and we can't rely on advertisers necessarily, but also appreciate it as a possible opportunity to have more of an ownership stake in your local media organizations and be able to support them that way. But I think it's too, in terms of kind of attitude and kind of cultural understanding of what our media is, it's important that we try and kind of look at the big picture. Like I said before, I still get dumbfounded the way so many people like to kind of kick the professional media for so many different things, for not being biased enough on their particular issue. I'm kind of an amateur student of history, and I find it interesting when I look back so many different examples where people kind of focus on their kind of a kind of rivalry and ignore a larger threat. They're too busy kind of squabbling with their old enemy to see kind of the storm clouds on the horizon. And so many interesting examples in history. I was like trying to check this book I had this morning. There's these people in 2nd century A.D., the Bucali, and they threw off this Roman outpost that was in this area of Egypt, started fomenting this rebellion, and instead of like rallying all the oppressed Egyptians to fight the Romans, they just kicked the Romans out so that they could invade Alexandria and fight their long-term enemy. And it's like, oh, the Romans are out. We can go back to, killing our old, centuries-old rivals, It would be as if, like, if Russia took over America and, like, the rural counties just invaded Salt Lake City, right? Like, instead of fighting off the Russians, they're like, now it's time to go get those city slickers, right? And it's an amazing example. You can see it all throughout history, and it's pretty much kind of the overlooked thread of Hamlet. Really, is that there's this family squabble that is so intense they don't even notice Fortinbras come in and invade and take over. Spoiler there, sorry. And then these are moments in history. And now you can imagine a moment where the media, our free press, has never been so undersupported, underfunded, overworked, and under attack, including by the most powerful people in the world, including our president. And imagine this situation. And when I say imagine, I mean look at this situation that is right now, where we've been figuratively and now literally shooting the messenger, because we've not been supporting, our fourth estate like we should. We'll just kind of close my talk with telling a bit about this thing I read. The Baltimore Sun did a story about the reporters at the Capitol Gazette, and they were reporting on their own shooting, and this is something we're seeing now more and more. It's that more terrible things are happening to our news organizations, that they have to report on the terrible things that happen to themselves. Usually it's just layoffs, but recently it was a shooting. And the Baltimore Sun did a story about the reporters reporting on their own shooting, and there was a reporter named Pat Ferguson, and he was reporting on it, and he was, in a group of reporters from all over that had come to the scene and were trying to get questions from the police. And they said, and at one point they realized that it was actually his newsroom, and he was there also asking questions of police. And then all the media, the national media, turned on him. And Ferguson found himself called out as a Capitol reporter. In moments, he was mobbed by national news cameras. He doesn't remember what he said, but he felt his words were imperfect. I should have told them to buy a local newspaper, he said. All right, well, that's my talk. I really appreciate your time, and I guess we'll have Q&A in a little bit. Okay, thank you.
as Eric mentioned, he brought a few handouts and additional information about resources, which I think we'll make available after the service in Elliott Hall if you want to come see those and talk to Eric. We're going to do a little bit of a break and have the offering, and then we'll come back after for some question and answer with Eric.
While we're doing the offering and getting settled here and tuned, I'll warn you that we're going to deal with another cheerful topic, World War III. How many of you got the chance to actually duck and cover in the 60s? Right? A lot of hands go up. So I grew up with Tom Lehrer's That Was the Year That Was. It was a cherished live performance that he did that covered all sorts of odd little bits of news, some local to California. There was one about a guy named George Murphy who was a performer who became a politician. Imagine that. And then one of his songs was specifically about nuclear war, which oddly enough is on our minds again, very strangely. It's called So Long Mom, and so I'll just finish here because it looks like we're winding up. Are we in tune?
Yeah, and the way Tom Lehrer used to introduce this song was he would say that, so many great songs came out of our great wars, like When Johnny Comes Marching Home Again, or Over There, Over There. And he said, that's great, but if we're going to have any songs that come out of World War III, we'd better write them now. So this is an example.
It's okay. 1, 2, 3.
So long, Mom, I'm off to drop the bomb, so don't wait up for me. But while you swelter down there in your shelter, you can see me on your TV. While we're attacking frontally, watch Brinkley and Huntley describing contrapuntally the cities we have lost. No need for you to miss a minute of the agonizing Holocaust. Well, little Johnny Jones, he was a U.S. pilot, and no shrinking violet was he. He was mighty proud when World War III was declared. He wasn't scared, no siree. And this is what he said on his way to Armageddon. So long, Mom, I'm off to drop the bomb, so don't wait up for me. But though I may roam, I'll come back to my home. Although it may be a pile of debris, remember, Mommy, I'm off to get a commie, so send me a salami and try to smile somehow. I'll look for you when the war is over, an hour and a half from now. Thank you. Oh, I want to say one thing. I don't know if there's going to be announcements, but I want to put in a shameless plug for the UU Camp Out. It's happening July 26th through the 29th. And if you go to the website, it's the very top thing on the list. So sign up today. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to go to a question and answer portion of this morning's forum. We're going to have a couple mics going around. If you have a question, raise your hand, let us know. I get myself, and hopefully if I can recruit an additional volunteer to help pass the mic around the other side. We'll bring it to you. Make sure to speak into the mic so that everyone can hear you. And if we don't get your question, we'll just have to repeat it back so that we have it on the record. So, who has a question? Okay.
Is this on?
Yeah.
It is. Item recently in the news is the molestation of the women by Joe Bishop when he was president of the Mission Training Center in Provo. Last, okay. In my mind, the web, I refer to it as Gutenberg 2. It's putting things out there like Gutenberg's printing press. It's revolutionary. Now, Joe Bishop, before he was president of Mission Training Center, he was president of Weber State University in Ogden. And he was chasing girls all the time. Now, I knew that. I was in business there for years. Others knew that. No one picked up on it. I wonder if the web had existed then, this is 30-something years ago, would that have been exposed? It wasn't then, and I think the newspaper must have known about it. Everybody else in town knew about it. Would it have been exposed with the web?
That's an interesting question. I mean, especially you're talking about something that happened 20 or 30 years ago. I mean, there's some other kind of factors at play, right? I mean, like, we've only really seemed to hit that kind of Me Too moment just recently. I could only speculate if the newspaper knew about it. And, you know, it's hard to wonder, you know, would the web have done something different? You know, maybe it would have. Maybe it would have been one of those situations where, like, it would have at least got the, you know, kind of the ball rolling. You know, if somebody had come out on the web in some format and started, you know, throwing out these allegations and maybe forcing some kind of, you know, more thorough investigation. Yeah, that's possible. I could see that. I mean, that's the kind of thing that you do see as a possible kind of positive benefit from kind of like the new voices of the social media and things like that. It is another way that kind of information kind of bubbles up to the surface. But I don't know, again, and maybe this is just because as you can kind of tell, I'm kind of anti-social media. You know, is that on average, is that doing you know, more good than harm? Because it's also possible, and we all also see situations where there are kind of through social media and things like that, there's oftentimes an allegation that kind of bubbles up that a reporter probably would not touch because it was just too hard to corroborate, or there's something wrong with it, and that could bubble up through the surface through social media, lead to hysteria, lead to violence sometimes, kind of a mob mentality, and that happens a lot too. So it's hard to, it can be hard to compare those things sometimes. And I lean more toward the idea that, you know, sometimes the way these information is disseminated through these totally kind of anarchic, you know, venues, it perhaps does more harm than good. But that's kind of my opinion. But I mean, you do bring up a good point. You know, if nothing else, the web does provide a venue for somebody that feels like that they're totally, you know, not being listened to perhaps get a story out. But we're also just in this situation where at the same time social media and the web has so polarized us that we might not recognize the value in it, you know, when it's this a story kind of bubbling up just out of all of this chaos, all of this fake news, all of this very heavily slanted, opinionated news. That's my feeling on that one.
Thank you, Eric, for coming and speaking to us today. I'd like to get your thoughts on how investigative journalists could be better compensated. Obviously, you guys have families and would like to keep you doing what you do rather than go off and do something else. One suggestion would be to make a better use of the donate button. I don't think it gets used enough. You could have at the end of each story, did you like this article? If so, donate, click the donate button, and half of the money will go to the paper and half will go to the journalist. And
No, I think that's interesting. I think that is a really, things like that are going to take more hold. My whole experiment with my nonprofit is trying to find a way to help kind of make sure investigative journalism doesn't disappear and support it and support reporters who want to do investigative journalism. But I'm also kind of realistic about the resources that media outlets have. I don't think I mentioned this before, like kind of with my nonprofit, I develop stories and then I give them for free to my media partners to get out there, and so I don't actually collect a compensation for stories I provide the Tribune or for smaller outlets, and the trainings I do for free are for free. And so, if you're wondering how I make money, you're asking the same question my wife keeps asking me, and I keep changing the subject. And this goes to your question, is that I'm exploring just trying to be able to get money through donations, grants. I'm hoping to build up a base where I can, afford to pay, reporters that want to do an investigative project something that's fair. That's actually something I've been starting to kind of play around with too. When the layoffs at the Tribune and the Standard Examiner had, for example, I did a little GoFundMe to try and raise money, and now I've got a couple of the laid off reporters working on stories. It's not a salary, but it's a decent amount. But yeah, the donate button is an interesting idea, and I think maybe that is something that perhaps people need to kind of play around with. But it's still really hard when you kind of think of the economics of it, because sometimes an investigative story can just take a lot of time and then go nowhere. And it's even if a lot of people appreciate one story and chip in a little bit of money for it, if they're at a newspaper, for example, it might not really cover what the paper might have lost had they been going and covering other stories, and that's the really tricky part of it. And that's why also I just in some way I'm trying to have my nonprofit be able to fill that niche, because I can perhaps take more time with a story, because I'm, my nonprofit, I don't churn out stories every day, every week. They're usually a month or, sometimes longer, because they can sometimes just take a long time to put together. But I do like that idea, and I have seen similar things like that, and I'm still I think it's still a little early. I'm still hoping to see how they pan out. I know a freelancer used to work at the Trib. She's writing a story for me, and she also set up this site where people can come in and donate or pay kind of a subscription fee to help her do work on a particular topic. She's trying to focus on water issues and stuff like that, and say, look, this is an issue that's important, but it's technical, it's tough to report. If you want to support me, here's this site. You can sign up to pay $5 a month or something like that. So seeing models like that, I think they're really new, and I hope they work out. But it's hard to say. And like I say, investigative journalism, it's just very time intensive, and there's always the possibility it can just kind of not work out. And sometimes investigative stories kind of feel like you're digging 10 miles down and then 10 miles over, and then sometimes that's it. You didn't find it, and you're there, and that's kind of how you spent your time. But it's still worth it chasing certain stories that are time intensive. I hope that answered your question.
So you've done a lot of presenting ethics and raised some serious concerns on where we're headed. I'm just wondering what movements or efforts do you know of that, I hate the word censorship, but help regulate the information that's blasted out on the internet? Do you know?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question too. It's like, how do you regulate fake news without censoring, right? I mean, that's a huge thing. And I would hope it would never come to like actually having to use any kind of tools of the state to that end. And that's why you still kind of like hope against hope that just through public awareness we can get people to be a little more conscientious about their news consumption. Like, I still keep feeling like if we really wanted to like get, I don't know if it's something that would be like a public campaign, but like I almost feel like if there was a role for like public money, or maybe not even public money, maybe it's just something that like we get enough people to kind of like support, but it would be kind of like a public awareness campaign, like we should get people thinking more and more about the sources, like I would like to go onto like Facebook, and when something pops up, I would like to see the first comment being, what's your source on this, right? Like, what is it? Like, how do I know this is true at all? Like I almost feel like it should be, we need a campaign that's like on par with like a safe sex campaign, right? It's like practice safe sharing, people, like actually think about that before you just click, and share it, like actually look it up. And it doesn't take long to look something up. Like, I've seen like a post come up, I can Google the first 5 words in the post, and then I'll see like an article saying, oh yeah, there's nothing here, that they distorted this, distorted that. You can do it quickly and easily, but it's just that, checking something isn't as quick as just sharing it, right? Because it already kind of fits your belief system. So you're like, oh yeah, no doubt this is true, I'm going to share it. That is a big problem. So I think it may just be something that like we have to like encourage that. I mean, maybe that's a good venue for kind of the civil society to step in and start saying like, look, we need to be more careful about this misinformation that's resulted from the social media polarization, tribalization, because it's so insidious in how it's affected society. I feel like this misinformation is like this new kind of cancer that we're not really taking seriously enough. But I keep looking back, and it's like, like 10 years ago, did people take flat Earth people seriously? Like, that's a thing now. That's a legitimate thing. And there are all sorts of fringe beliefs that are very legitimate all of a sudden, or have that prominence. Because people aren't checking sources, people aren't thinking, and people are just following the media links and stuff that pre-exist with their beliefs and are telling them to think so that they don't have to think. The theme I repeated. So.
Hi, Mr. Peterson. I'm Lula. I have a couple of questions for you. Are you only domestic or are you international? Because I know journalists in Gaza, and I've been to Jordan, Israel, Palestine, Dubai, you name it, and these journalists don't get money. They're trying to get stories out for survival, and these are young people, and some of them $10 a day, some of them nothing, so they have to group together. And a lot of them, it is because of religion. They don't agree with the religion, and they can't get out of Gaza. You know this. And so journalism is their only outreach to the world for many of them, just to survive as a nation. You have these leaders that are suppressing them, And so journalism is the most important thing, even besides food, because if you don't have the journalists, then the children don't eat. And it goes on and on and on and on. So are you only domestic or are you international? Because that is the survival of a lot of these young people's future around the world.
Yeah, I wish I could be international. I am very domestic now. It's part of the nonprofit's mission. We're really just trying to support kind of local journalists here. That is another huge issue that you kind of bring up. It's interesting. It's a whole other discussion how these kind of shrunken newsrooms have affected international reporting, because it's like you say, there are people that go out to like the toughest kind of war zones and difficult situations, and they're no longer under the umbrella of a large media organization. They're really freelancers, totally unprotected, incredibly vulnerable situations. They've still got a passion for it, and they're still trying to make a living out of it. But they don't have, the support they used to have, 20 or 10 or even 5 years ago. That's a very difficult situation. I wish I could support that more. I wish I had the ability, but I'm also still I consider my nonprofit very successful on all fronts except money right now. Like, we're doing good work, getting out good stories, doing good trainings, but, I don't have money I wish I could pay an international journalist. I think that would be fascinating. I would love to get to that point one day. I'm not there right now.
First, a short story and then a question that I thought you might appreciate the story, which is that right after the 2016 election, my carpool mate and I, driving to work the next morning, were trying to raise our spirits, and we looked at each other and said, what can we do? And we thought about it for a little bit, and we said, hire a journalist. So he subscribed to the Times, and I subscribed to the Post. But hearing your talk makes me realize how important the local part of it is. And so the question for you first was just whether you buy the story that what really yanked the rug out of newspapers, out from underneath newspapers, was the loss of classified ads. Because if that's the case, then we could go after Craigslist, because they're local. The whole thing about Craigslist is that they're local, and they should be plowing some of that money back into the community. But is it classified ads, or is it just?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not the exact expert on all the business side of it, but like that really was like just such a huge hit to newspapers, was the classified ad section, and I know that that's always been just a real revenue generator, that really kind of just changed everything, I think. And it's interesting about Craigslist. I agree in theory, but like I don't know like how you could like really compel them to like direct some funds maybe to a local media institution, but yeah. Yeah. But yeah, the internet, the classifieds, that was such just a bread and butter for the newspaper industry that they've really just not figured out how to make money after that. And I think it's really been hard too, just because so many media organizations just immediately out the gate put their product online for free. And now, it's only now I think some are realizing that they've got to try and like maybe charge, put up the paywalls and things like that. And it's very difficult because we've been so accustomed to just getting it for free, that now we're also in the bind that, media organizations are asking for asking consumers to pay for the news at a point where we're diminished. So some people, I've seen comments where people are like, oh, it's not worth paying for it. Like, I'll just go to another media organization that's free and I'll read their stories. So paywalls have perhaps come up just too late, and maybe someone should have seen that coming a lot sooner with the hit that all the organizations took after the classified ad revenue just disappeared so quickly. But then again, at that same time, everyone was just kind of like drinking the Kool-Aid that the internet was just so magical that it was going to just, money was just going to come somewhere. It was just going to come out, you know, and then it's going to support this thing. And the model really is not, you know, it's not. The digital ads are just not the same, you know. Another question?
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up the paywall, because I'll admit, I don't know where to get my news from, and I would love to pay someone if I knew who had decent news. So, as a journalist, where do you get your news, and who do you recommend?
I got a Sunday Times subscription. I like the paper, and I pay for the Trib's digital subscription. I mean, when you think about it, it's like $8 a month. I mean, it's like Netflix, you know, or something like. And I don't know how many people have like a Netflix or a Hulu or Spotify or something like that. Like, I used to pay $10 a month for a Spotify to listen to the streaming music, and I canceled that so I can just listen to it with ads. And then I got a Trib digital subscription, you know, and I use it more, you know, and I read more stories since I pay for it, because I know I got a little bit of an ownership here now, like, and it's actually beneficial to me. But you know, like you could easily get, you know, like a digital Trib subscription, then you could still check out the Deseret News to see, like, if, you know, what their take on it is, see what their coverage is like, and they're still free, you know. So for a local, you know, like I'd recommend, you know, checking out both the state dailies, you know, check out something large and reputable for national news, like the Washington Post or, you know, the New York Times, things like that. Try and mix it up. A couple good sources is good. Like, I usually read the Trib, but I like to check the Deseret News every now and then just to see, you know, there are sometimes differences, or sometimes there's stories that one outlet will do that the other won't. And it's good to kind of have a well-rounded diet, you know.
So I want to thank you for what you're doing and your commitment to impartial professional journalism, and for navigating those difficult conversations with your spouse. And I guess I'm curious, are there other Erics around the country who are doing what you're doing and spinning off from and starting nonprofits and trying to really adhere to this code of journalistic ethics and go deep?
Yeah, it is encouraging. There are a number of these kind of state nonprofit journalism outfits. I mean, the big national model is ProPublica, if you've heard of them. Really amazing, but you know, they had some backing from some pretty wealthy backers to get going, and they do incredible investigative stories. And there are other smaller ones in different states. One of my contributors is a reporter named Roan Tempest, and he really kind of came out of nowhere because he had moved to Utah, but he had actually founded one in Wyoming called Wyofile, and they did really interesting stuff. I based some of my stuff on one in New Mexico called New Mexico in Depth. There's one in California called the Center for Investigative Reporting, and it's a pretty big one too. I think Florida's got the Center for Public Integrity. So it's a model that's popping up. I think mine, I don't want to say mine's totally unique in that besides just developing stories, I also do trainings. But I don't know, I haven't heard of other outlets that really focus on that. But that's a big part of like how I also want to contribute. You know, I go to trainings, I go to like college newsrooms, I've done trainings at like a TV newsroom, smaller papers, and really walk people through on like, you know, this is how you file for records requests. And when you get records, your stories are going to be a lot better, they're going to be richer, and, you know, reveal more. And how to look up databases and find information online. I think that's really critical. But But yeah, it is encouraging. There is other models like this.
Well, you mentioned ProPublica, and one of the places that I go for news is public television and also public radio. And I think it's extraordinary, the caliber of journalism that's available on those channels. Even the FNX First Nation exchange is full of information about our country and Native Americans. And there's Deutsche Welle, and there's also France 24 on Channel 9. And having access to these channels certainly does open up a perspective on the way the news is reported in this country. And to have those channels available without advertising, I find very encouraging, and I just wish more people would use them. Frontline is probably the benchmark for journalism in this country for anybody who does investigative reporting. But I think there are places, I know there are places where we can get good news, especially on the international, and it's not on the commercial TV, it's on our public television. And they expand their coverage from the way it was 10 years ago, with the perspectives that we're getting on Africa. For example, there are special programs on Africa on Channel 9.2. I don't have cable, so I just use the antenna, but I'm able to get a vast range of international news. And it's very helpful for international news reporting on this country so that we see what they're in Europe thinking and saying about the United States.
Yeah, I mean, of course, I forgot to mention public news, radio and television, and so there's already a model there too. I guess in some ways, a little bit of what I've been doing is different, and I guess it's more kind of print focused, but not solely. But yeah, but public television. I mean, there again, there's already a model. I think like if you enjoy that, you're supporting that. It's another thing just to think, what are other models similar to that we can support. It's interesting too. You mentioned that you don't have cable. Because, it kind of goes again to this thing, because I remember growing up just watching a lot of public television, because we didn't have cable. We only had 10 channels, and a couple of them were public television, and they had really informative stuff there. And again, we're now in that age where we have so much information available that what rises to the top isn't always the most substantive, right? Yeah, I mean, it's the fake news, or just kind of the quick hit stuff. It's not the really meaty, policy issues and stuff that we really need. And in some ways, you probably have scores less of channels available to you. You're probably more informed than a lot of people who have 1,000 channels, and then just get stuck on a cable news channel, and then, then it's Cake Wars or whatever, but yeah, great point though. Yeah.
I wanted to mention High Country News is a good source. They have an investigative journalist fund, and they do investigative long-form reporting. I'm a librarian, and I've been recently reading articles about libraries trying to make up for the loss of small-town newspapers by collecting local information themselves and making it available through the library. Librarians have a lot of common interests as far as fake news, and I was wondering if your project had formed any coalition with libraries or thought about that.
Not until now. That's really a great idea, actually. That's really interesting. Sorry, I'm kind of thinking about that. Yeah, especially community libraries. I mean, you might especially get people who don't have access maybe to normal media outlets. No, that's a really great idea. Yeah. I don't know. I'm going to follow up on that.
Will you tell us again how we can donate to your nonprofit?
Oh, shameless plug. Yeah. Yeah, it's UtahInvestigative.org. And I have cards. I don't have enough. UtahInvestigative.org is in investigative journalism. And there's a donate button right in the top corner. Can't miss it. So, and it is tax deductible. We are a 501c3 nonprofit. Great question. Great.
This is more an idea than a question for you, but you were talking about how many typos are occurring in our paper media. And has anyone thought about perhaps having citizen editors that would help with language, et cetera, because there are so many well-educated older citizens that have some time available to donate to the media.
Yeah, I don't. That is an interesting idea too. I mean, I think if you, right, yeah, just to, I think it's an interesting idea. I kind of have to suss out kind of the details of it, because I know. I don't know. I mean, I guess you might have to like see if there are people who'd be interested in kind of that kind of volunteering, just to look through something for typos, how it might be kind of integrated into existing kind of, copy editing routines, because I know, with the top copy editors in the state is my wife. She works at the Trib at night, and but you would have to have people kind of come in at night, I think, and it'd be a question of like, does somebody want to come in at like 10:30 to read something, like. So there are questions about that, but again, one of those kind of volunteer kind of models in different ways. That might be useful. I mean, you'd really just need like a sharp eye. Just to make sure, just for those kinds of things. Like, I think it's interesting, yeah.
Because of time, let's have this be our final question.
I have a question about curation. It took me a while before I realized that Facebook was serving me the kind of stories that it thought I liked. And it wasn't long after that I realized the New York Times basically curates news that happens to appeal to my political sensibilities. And so I read the New York Times. I don't read the stuff, except for whitehouse.gov, once in a while, because I want to see the kind of propaganda that comes out daily. But it's the stuff that I don't want to read about, or I'm really not interested in, that's the most important. And how do you curate that?
Yeah, that's tough. Because I know what you're saying, like, especially when you're kind of dealing with like news you see online, you really kind of have to work at seeing stuff that you don't agree with and not kind of like filtering it out. And I know, like, on my Facebook timeline, I have people on both sides of the kind of the political spectrum. Sometimes I see their stuff posted and I just like, it just drives me crazy, but I kind of like just have to leave it there. I feel like, and sometimes I click on it, like sometimes like a really right-wing kind of nutty stuff, or stuff that's really, left-wing, like maybe too extreme too, just because I want to see what it is. And there's kind of again, like you kind of have to recognize how all the systems are curating for you and kind of resist going with the flow per se. As far as how else you kind of curate to like find the stuff that you don't know about, like I don't know that we've figured out a digital equivalent of what a physical newspaper does for you. I think probably a lot of you recognize this, just how helpful it is to have a physical newspaper, and you start reading the article you like, and then you finish it, and then your eyes just go down to like an article you wouldn't have picked before, and you start reading it, and you go, oh wow, that was fascinating. Since I got this Time subscription, like I started noticing that, like there's some things like, oh, I want to read this, and then the article that really blew me away was one I never would have clicked on or never would have been curated for me. I don't know, like, I'm not sure how, like, they're going to do that in a digital sense. I wish they could figure out something to that effect. But it really is part of kind of the physical experience, I think, of news reading.
I don't know if this model has been attempted, but it seems like if the various news outlets would pool together and come together and form a collective that would make articles available on a per view basis, like at 10 cents a view or 25 cents a view or $1 a view, that people could click on that based possibly by a Google News search or because they wanted to find it from that particular outlet, that they could cobble together small contributions and get their views that way.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea too. Or I guess there's just a question of, like, again, can you kind of get over those kind of long-standing rivalries, you know, even within news organizations, and figure out a model of sharing that works. Yeah, I mean, if I was a publisher, I'd push for it, but I don't know. Yeah, it's an interesting idea. Again, you know, then you also got to contend with certain organizations having a particular voice, and, you know, if they all go in together on certain stories, does it kind of match everyone's mission? I think it should be workable. I know that there would probably be a lot of problems in execution, but also seems like something that could work. I mean, it'd be worth giving a shot, just considering how dire everything is right now. Yeah, it's a good idea. Okay.
Let's give Eric a hand.